great idea.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Beer Bootcamp Sessions Live. My name is Julian, and with me we have got Phil Allen from Anderson Valley Brewing Company at the moment. My name is Julian. And what's nice about Phil is he started professionally brewing in in 1988 for Redhook Brewery in Seattle, Washington. 1990 he moved to Pike Place, where he was the head brewer there for 8 years. In 1999 he was awarded the Brewers Association Russell Schehrer Award for Innovation and Achievement in Craft Brewing, and currently Phil has obviously written a couple books as well. Where's that book you got there, Phil? The book on the Gozer. There we go. You can
Everyone should have one.
Very good, very good. And then, of course, so welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us, Phil.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's quite a pleasure. Glad to do it.
Excellent. So what are we going to be talking about this evening? I know you were mentioning, of course, you're going to talk a bit about gozers and things like that, but we're going to talk a bit about barrel-aged beers and a couple that you're going to show us this evening.
Yeah, I thought, when a lot of the pubs are closed, breweries are looking for things to do. And, there's certainly lots to do, like a deep cleaning, always a good idea. There's lagers that you can brew, certainly a good idea. They usually take about 3 months to brew a good lager, 2 to 3 months. So here's a perfect time to get some in. I think in 3 months, we'll be back to drinking beer together.
Yes, yes.
But another thing that you can do is start your barrel program, or build up your barrel program, because barrel-aged beers, the non-sour type, take anywhere from 1 to 9 months, and then of course sour barrel-aged beers could take a lot longer. They can take anywhere from 9 months to 3 or 4 years. So I have a couple examples here. We make quite a bit of barrel-aged beer. We probably have about 2,000 barrels in progress right now. And I would say that maybe just over a third of those are non-sour. So for beers like we make the Huge Arthur bourbon barrel-aged imperial stout. That's a non-sour beer. It spends 6 months in the barrel. And then we have about probably just over 2/3 of our barrels are sour beer production, and we have quite a few of those. So a good example of that is our Thribble Current. Pull back so you can see it. And this is a beer where we take our triple wort, which we make for our Belgian triple, and we start the fermentation with a wild culture that comes from our property. And it has wild yeast, some of our house yeast, lactobacillus, pediococcus, definitely some Brettanomyces. And we get it started for a day in stainless and then transferred into wine barrels. So the rest of the production can take place there. Fermentation, hopefully after 24 or 48 hours in stainless, has calmed down a little bit. So when we run it into the barrels, it's still going, but it's not that really active fermentation that's going to, flow over and outside of the barrels. So that's a pretty good thing. It gets it out of the brewery and off into the barrel production section. So you're not taking up a fermenter for the entire time that it has to be there. And that's one way to do it. And we have had good results with that. I think that beer is one of my favorites that we make, fun beer. Then we make a lighter beer, same wild culture, but done differently. We make a wheat beer, relatively low gravity, comes out about 5%. And we ferment that completely out like you would a normal beer in fermentation with the house yeast. And then we run it outside and ferment it the rest of the way with the mixed culture. So it's not quite as wild and sour as the other style, but it's a way you can do it. And then we have a beer that we do in a fermenter that we keep outside away from the building because we're afraid of this beer. And this beer is fermented first with house yeast. It's a barley wine. And then we sour it with pediococcus. And that takes about 4 years to sour a big beer like this. So that just gives you some of the ideas of the different things you can do in your sour program. And it could be as easily done as fermenting a beer, running it into barrels and letting it sour for, 3 to 9 months. Or you can do, different approaches that are a mix of that, and then just completely doing 100% barrel production, sour and fermented in the barrel.
When you're busy doing your souring, obviously you mentioned you got to keep the bugs away from the rest of the brew house, first of all.
Oh, yeah.
You, you also got to, you said the last one you keep quite far away. I mean, do you just have separate barrel rooms for each of the different beers that you do at the same time? Or how do you manage wild yeast in the brew house, for example?
Well, we are fortunate. We have 28 acres to work with here. So we actually have separate buildings that are far away. You guys, at your place, you have a lot of room too. There are a couple breweries who have tried to do it all in one building, do their regular beers and their sour beer production in the same building. And most of them have found that that's a very bad idea. I think one of the breweries here in California that has talked a lot about it is called the Brewery, spelled differently. And they tried that and then got cross-contamination and had actually to move into separate locations. I was very afraid of wild yeast or bacteria in the brewery. So from the get-go, we started in a separate building, and we're lucky enough to have that. Firestone Walker had a very brief time that they were doing it in the same area, but then they decided the safest thing to do is to move to another zip code. So they're in a whole different town with their sour production. Not everybody can afford that, but you should at the very least have a definite physical wall being a barrier between your sour beers and your non-sour beers. I think that's really important and can't be overemphasized, because I really believe that there are really two types of breweries in the world: those who haven't had an infection yet, and those that are going to get an infection. I mean, you've either had one or you're gonna get one. So even the most careful brewery not making sour beers, eventually something goes wrong and you'll catch some bacteria in there and have an infection. So, making your chances greater by having sour barrel production in the same room or the same building is just a bad idea. So as much as you can, separate them out. If you're doing it at home, you can put your sour beer outside, because once you've started to sour it, it's not going to get more infected. It's already infected. So you can leave those carboys, out in the garden shed or somewhere outside, and you'll be a lot safer.
Very good. Now tell me, we got one of the questions from one of our viewers this evening. It says, do you ever do a mixed culture, not a kettle sour, goza?
Mixed cultured goza. We've talked about doing one. Actually, we have tried one, and it was not as successful as we would have liked. The reason we've stuck with the kettle sour is and I think, we need to be very clear that there are two types of souring. There's the brew house souring, which is meant to make a certain type of beer. And there's the barrel aged souring, which is really a different animal. So, some people say, oh, well, the brew house souring is cheating. It's not cheating, it's different beers. It's like, a stout and a pale ale. They're just going to produce very different kinds of beers. And they both have their place. The mixed culture gozas, we haven't done except for that one trial. And the problem doing them is that they are complicated. They're like making a barrel-aged sour beer, and you have to take the same kind of precautions. Not that many people do them. There are a few that do. I in particular, not Goza, but Berliner Weiss, Schnuel in Berlin does a mixed culture fermentation, making their Berliner Weiss. And they believe, and I think they're correct, that originally that's how Berliner Weiss was done, with the mixed culture, and it took a lot longer, and there's definitely Brettanomyces involved in that. So you have a house yeast, you have lactic acid bacteria, probably lactobacillus, as well as some Brettanomyces. And we've never tried to do a Goza that way, but we have done a lot of other beers that way. I think a beer I showed a little earlier, the Horsetongue Wheat, it's a wheat beer like a Goza, and it's mixed fermentation with yeast, bacteria, and Brettanomyces, wild yeast. And it has some very nice flavors. I think we could do that recipe again and do it with some salt and a little bit of coriander and get it into, use a Goza base to do it. That'd be really interesting. It's a good idea. Now that we don't have that much production, maybe we'll do that. I like that idea.
There you go. So it's something for you to do while the lockdown situation, but we'll get to that a bit later on. One of the list viewers as well, it says he makes a lactose starter every single time as per your book every time. He kettle sours, he keeps a small amount back to grow up for the next time. Would you say there's a limit to the amount of times you can actually do this?
Well, it kind of depends on your method. I think the quick answer is yes, there's a limit. The more complete answer is, well, the limit depends on how clean you are. For example, we pick up some yeast in our lactic acid ferments sometimes, not very often, but sometimes. And that limits the amount of times we can use it. That yeast will start to ferment some of the sugars before we get into souring, and that can be a problem. It can drop the gravity lower than we like. So if you're very, very clean, you can continue to run that prop almost indefinitely. But most breweries, most home brewers can't really be that clean. You're going to start to pick up some other bacteria or some yeast in there, and that's going to cause some flavor and souring changes. So, I think it's a matter of getting to know your lacto and know your procedures. I would say that most folks could easily do 4 to 10 times generations of it before they need to go back and reculture from the original. If you're super clean and you have the ability to test for yeast or other bacteria, you could go indefinitely, I think.
So the key there is obviously keeping everything pretty clean and tidy from the beginning. Makes sense as well, looking after your yeast. So getting onto your barrel aged beers, you showed us a number of them this evening. Can you just go through your process? Obviously, you mentioned you go from the brew process, you put them into stainless, and then you put them into barrel. And then do you 6 months, 9 months, a year, obviously tasting in between? And how many barrels per brew are you able to produce?
Well, those are all good questions, and they all kind of depend on a lot of different variabilities. For us here, we have a 100-barrel brew house, and we can short batch down to about 70 barrels, and they're 31 U.S. gallons in a U.S. barrel. So it's a lot of beer. We also have a much smaller brew house, which is about 10 hectoliters, and we use that sometimes for barrel production, but 10 hectoliters doesn't fill up a lot of barrels. If you're using wine barrels, those are about 61 U.S. gallons. Bourbon barrels are, I think, about 58 U.S. gallons. I don't know what rum barrels are, or cachaça, or whatever you guys have available out there. I think wine barrels are fairly standard. And for making sour beer, we really like wine barrels. First of all, I think if there's any residual wine flavor, it can go quite nice with a lot of the beers, and that's good. Wine yeast, nice with beer. Our favorite thing is, if you're in a wine growing region, to talk to your wineries and say, listen, I know you guys have Brettanomyces infections in your barrels sometimes, and you don't want them, but we do. Call us. We'll come get them for free. And we have 40 something wineries in our valley here, and when they get a Brett infection, they call us, and they're always very upset. They're like, if you don't come today, we're just going to burn these barrels, and they want to get rid of them. So it's great. We get barrels that are already pre-infected with Brett, which we want for some of those beers, and we get them for free. And wine barrels are made better than rum or bourbon barrels. They hold up a lot longer. Their hoops are galvanized. They're made with a better quality of oak, and there's a larger variety of oak. The one thing that they don't have that the bourbon barrels do have is bourbon barrels have a very, very deep char on them, and wine barrels don't have that. So if you're looking for what that brings to the table, then you really need a bourbon barrel. I don't think any other spirit does that sort of deep charring of the barrels. Wine barrels are lightly toasted, even with a heavy toast. It doesn't really come close to the char that bourbon barrels get. And that char can be about that thick, you know. What is that? 10 millimeters? Uh-oh, I seem to have lost your audio. Do you still have my audio?
Yeah, no, it's about 5-10 millimeters. You're right. Yeah, so it's about that size. So I had a ruler here somewhere, but it's about the size of a 10 spanner. That's a 10 spanner there.
Yeah.
About
Yeah,
that much. There we go.
the char can be quite deep. So it depends on what you're looking for out of a barrel, but we like the wine barrels, and so that's what, and they're also in our neighborhood, and so we use a lot of them. We like using things that, as much as we can, local products.
Great stuff. And tell me, just in terms of your fruit sours and doing it in barrels, or would you rather do a fruit sour in stainless?
Well, we do it both ways. We make the gozas that are fruited in stainless, and we make fruited sour beers in barrels. And I think it kind of depends on what you're going for. The really nice thing about barrels, if you're a production brewery and you're already got limited fermenter or conditioning tank space, going into barrels for souring is quite nice. So quite often brewers will either fully end ferment a beer and then sour it, or start that fermentation in stainless, and then at the very, towards the end, in the latter half of fermentation, run it into the barrels and do whatever they need to. So what we do with, I'll use an example of the Tribble Current. That beer starts in stainless for a couple days and then goes into barrels, and we fruit it in the barrels when fermentation is in between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way done. You have to know how, where that is, but certainly for most beers, that'd be somewhere in the, for big beers, 10-degree Plato range, just below that. And we add the fruit then. And the reason we want to add the fruit during fermentation is because we don't want to end up with a sweet beer. When you're souring, it's less likely that you'll end up with a sweet beer, but we don't want a lot of that fructose sugar left in there. So we macerate the fruit or use fruit puree, and we add it in the last portion of fermentation. That way the yeast eat a lot of it. But at that point, your evolution of CO2 from the yeast is at its very end too. So you're not blowing off, gassing off a lot of the fruit flavor and aroma. So if you add it in at the end of fermentation, you get the benefit of the yeast eating the sugar, which you don't really want in there. And since it's not making as much carbon dioxide during that last portion of fermentation, you don't lose as much of the aroma to that part of the process. So you have a nice fruit flavor and aroma, and yet you don't have a lot of the residual sugar. And then if you're souring that, the bacteria will take care of any leftover sugars in there, and really give you a nice kind of balanced beer.
Excellent. And tell me, how important is it to limit your oxygen interacting with the wort while doing your kettle souring?
We have found, well,
yes, yeah. Buy the book, read the book.
I just can't go into enough detail here, but I think it's very important, and it depends on a lot of different things. If you take your mash and you try and sour just the mash, there's so much oxygen entrained in the mash that helps float it up, which is a good thing under normal circumstances. But all that oxygen is going to be available to some bacteria that you really don't want to be working in that mash. So what we do is we mash, we then get the wort off the mash and sour just the wort. And the benefit of that is you've left all that oxygen and husk matter behind, which you don't want involved in the process. And the oxygen, again, there are certain bacteria which make very unpleasant aromas and flavors that require oxygen. So you want to remove it as fast as possible and as much as possible within reason. And then you also want to get the pH to start dropping, because those bacteria are much more sensitive to pH, and they won't operate once the pH is below about 4. You know, it's 4.1, 4.2. It's in the book. But once you get that pH drop, then you don't have to worry about those bacteria at all. So eliminating the oxygen is a good thing, particularly if you're starting off with a higher pH. And then once the pH drops, you want to keep it out of there anyway. So once the pH is below 4 and you don't have a lot of oxygen, those bacteria won't grow. Your lacto will grow, and it will sour the beer very quickly, particularly if you put a nice healthy pitch in there. And once you get down to your correct pH, you boil, and that drives off any oxygen that was left in the liquid, and that's good. Then you do whatever you hop or fruit or whatever you're going to do, and then you run to the heat exchanger, and you're going to have to re-add oxygen, of course, for your yeast fermentation, because yeast need a lot of oxygen. And if you don't re-add the oxygen there, you're not going to get a complete fermentation.
Okay, great stuff. And tell me, do you get concerned, obviously, with the oxygen ingress in barrels?
Yes, that can be of a big concern too, but it's a double-edged sword. And winemakers know this kind of better than anybody. One of the benefits of using a wooden barrel is that oxygen does slowly pass through the wood and into the liquid. Winemakers call that micro aeration, and it has some benefits to it. And when winemakers don't use barrels and they do 100% stainless, both for fermenting and aging, they will micro aerate within the stainless, because it does have benefits. Now, too much oxygen is negative. So a perfect example of that is when you have a nice big beefy red wine, you open it, you pour it into a decanter, you let it breathe for a while. If you taste that wine right when the bottle's open, you'll see that it's not as round as it could be. It's kind of a little elbow and leggy. And if you let it sit for an hour, it opens up and the aroma and flavor is much better. And this is true with beer, but that window is very, very short. And if you let that wine sit out for too long, a day, then it's going to be not as good. So the same is true with barrels. You want some oxygen to make it in through the wood. But what you don't want is, as the beer evaporates in that barrel and the level drops, leaving a bigger headspace, that headspace to be filled with oxygen that's interacting with that beer. And it all has to do with, physics. When the barrel's completely full, and as it drops, because of the shape of the barrel, the surface area that oxygen's in contact with is very small. But as you go down in that barrel, as that liquid level drops, that not only is there more air, there's more surface area to interact between the air and the beer. So I think it's very important to keep your barrels topped up. We top up every one of our barrels that's going to be out there any more than about 3 months. We top them up about every 3 months. So a couple non-sour beers we make are in the barrel just 3 months. Those we don't top. The ones that are in there 6 months, depending on the beer and the season, we may top. And anything more than 6 months, we start topping every 3 months, whether they're sour or non-sour. And because chemical reactions take place faster when it's warmer, if we have a beer that is going to be in the barrel 5 months, and those 5 months are, the end parts in the winter, we don't worry as much. But if those 5 months, the end parts in the summer, then we worry more. So we like to top our barrels as often as we can. Most of the California beer barrel agers that I've talked to, Vinny Cilerzo from Russian River, Tommy Arthur from Lost Abbey, Eric Rose from, he's sold, so he's not there anymore. Anyway, most of the ones I've talked to all say the same thing. You got to keep your barrels topped. Some of them don't do it as often as we do. Some do it more often than we do. But I think the two key things that we found are topping your barrels, very important. Keep out unwanted oxygen and keep out the growth of acetic acid bacteria, which makes vinegar out of your beer. You don't want that. And even a little bit of that can really ruin a beer. In some beers, there's a little is good, but definitely not too much. So acetobacter requires oxygen to create its acetic acid. So you want to keep those barrels topped up to keep that from happening. The other thing you want to do, and this is something Vinny told me at Russian River, is that keeping the barrels at the right temperature, which I'm not good at converting temperatures, but I think it's 17 and below to a reasonable temperature. So in Fahrenheit, it's 45 to 60. Whatever
that's about right. It's about 17, say 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. And obviously, are those rooms air conditioned for the summer? Are they? Is it a natural cellar temperature? All of that kind of stuff. And then tell me the topping up. I mean, where do you top it up from other barrels? How do you get the topping up done?
We top up usually from other barrels, and there's any number of ways you can do it. We found that one of the easiest ways is to pick up, get a barrel. It's your sacrificial barrel. Lift it up. If you have a forklift, if you don't have a forklift, lifting it up is kind of hard. With a forklift, really easy. Pick it up and then just let gravity. We have a little wand we go through and top up the barrels, and then we sacrifice one to fill up, 10 others. And as far as temperature control, we are much more concerned with the non-sour barrels, keeping them at an even cooler temperature so that none of this happens. So we actually keep those refrigerated. For the sour barrels, your temperature range can fluctuate a lot more. And so we have a passive cooling system that we use. We are very fortunate that even in the summer, our evenings get quite cool down to probably about 13, 15, pretty much every night. And so we have big fans that turn on in the late evening and suck in the cold air. And then we keep that building closed up during the day when it's hottest.
And then tell me, when it comes to packaging sour, obviously, do you blend or back blend all the same barrels, or do you actually just use barrel for barrel into packaging from there?
I think, the real art of sour barrel production is blending. I think anybody who makes really good sour beer will tell you. The non-sour barrels, they get blended, but it's just a matter of being easier that way. And you do get more consistency, but they really aren't that different. They're not in the barrel that long. The flavors they're picking up are not that varied. But with sour beers, the variation can be enormous. And there are barrels that come out and they're fantastic. And all of the brewers, we do tasting. We taste every barrel before we decide on a blend. And that sounds fun until you have to taste 70 barrels. So it's actually kind of fun towards the end. But we taste them all and make notes, and then decide which ones are going to go into the blends and which ones are, going to be left out. And the left out ones, some of them are so bad they will need to get dumped. You will have failures, no doubt. But some of them are just not the right quality. They have too much of something or not enough of something, and we save them for a different blend where we need some of that. So, for example, if you have 20 barrels and one of them is really acidic, it may not be appropriate for that blend. But if you have another blend where a whole bunch of barrels aren't quite acidic enough, that one could blend in very nicely. So that would be a good way to do it. And
Yes.
you always get the brewers who say, you have this one barrel, like, oh, let's just package that one barrel. It's so good, it's perfect. And you could do that, But really, the key is to figure out a blend, because that leaves the ones that are not quite as good kind of off. And what you don't want to do, at least we don't want to do, you don't want to release a beer where one of them is absolutely fantastic, and then your next release of a single barrel is not as good. So you really try and find a happy medium with the correct blend, barrels that bring the things that you want to that blend, the acidity or the amount of Brett flavor, or a little tiny hint of the acetic acid or a hint of the nail polish that you want in there.
Very good. So obviously, barrels are very tricky. You want to put your best into bottles, and the blending process, like you said, it's a long thing, but it's fun, and towards the end of it, it get long, and you want to be consistency. In terms of doing a red wine barrel, what would you recommend as a good base for a red wine barrel? Obviously, depending on the red wine, we're looking like a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Shiraz or a Merlot barrel.
It kind of depends on where you want the final beer to end up. I've had great lighter beers that have been in red wine barrels, and the lighter beer allows for more of that flavor of the wine to come through, which I think is nice. But red wines, I think, are comparable to some of the darker beers. So a brown beer, a Belgian Oud Bruin, for example, I think would be great in a red wine barrel. And I kind of like that roasty character of a brown beer, a dark beer, with the kind of richness and robustness of the red wines. So if it's your first attempt, I would go with something that isn't going to be that isn't going to show the wine too much, and it's going to be a little bit easier to get the flavors to meld. So something like a brown beer with a red wine barrel, I think would be nice. We've done a couple stouts in port barrels, which I think were quite nice. The port was, big enough to stand up to the stout, but you don't want the beer to overpower the flavor you want from the barrel. So you got to be a little careful with that. And you also don't want to put a white wine, a white light colored beer into a big heavy red barrel, unless that's really what you're intending to pull out of there. You will get a lot of flavor, and even sometimes color. If the barrel has been used a few times and you get it very fresh, there's still wine in there, it's going to pull that wine out of there, and you'll actually get some color as well as flavor. So that can be a really interesting and delicious beer, but it's got to be what you're looking for.
Cool. And then tell me, obviously, you've got a number of cellarmen looking after your cellars, how do you keep track of the barrels? Do you have a sheet per barrel, the wet details, the flavor details, obviously, over a period of time? I mean, you're putting a barrel or 20 barrels or 30 barrels in a cellar, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. What is the process about tracking your barrel over the period of time?
Well, we have a spreadsheet. We give each barrel a unique, identifier. One of our problems has been that we have had, over a 4-year period, we might have 2 or 3 different barrel cellar people that were in charge of that. So we have lost track of a few. We do have a few barrels we're not really quite sure what's in them, but we taste them, and once you taste them, you kind of decide, well, we don't exactly know what this is, but this could go good in a blend over here. But we have a big spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and we keep track of them. And we, the things that we list is, of course, the base beer that went in there, the type of barrel it was, red wine, white wine, bourbon, other tequila, whatever you're going to put it in. Those are all important. We list the bacteria and the batch number. So when there's questions about a barrel, we can always refer back to the brew sheet to see what, how that brew went, and what the base beer was like. Then of course we also have to track the fruit, which we do on the brew sheet, whether it was fruited or not.
Important. And secondly, tell me, what do you estimate is the proportion of barrels that you dump, or do you manage everything that well that you just don't dump anything?
No, we don't. We don't. We don't. I think if you're doing particularly long-term non-sour, like our huge Arker takes 9 months to a year, that beer is kind of bulletproof. You're probably not going to dump any of that. I don't think we've ever dumped a barrel of that. It's so beefy. It goes in at 12.5% and comes out close to 15% alcohol. So it's pretty beefy. Not a lot going to happen there that's not good. With some of the lighter beers or some of the sour beers, you can quite easily get into, areas we've had barrels that have gone acetic, and we've had some that were so acetic, they were just vinegar. And we had a barrel out sitting on the fence line quite a ways from everything else that actually we put a spigot in the bottom so that employees could take home some malt vinegar because it went that far off. It's really good malt vinegar, but terrible beer. So yeah, we definitely, you have problems. And sometimes weird things will grow in those barrels. You can't tell what it is. The flavors are just overwhelmingly unpleasant. And, you don't always know why. You have to be careful and you have to taste them a lot. And I think as a professional brewer anyway, you can't be afraid to dump beer. You gotta say, I'm going for quality here. I'm not going for quantity. Here's my limit. And for us, if any one of the brewers thinks it should be dumped, we dump it. If everybody agrees that it's got to be dumped, that's an easy one. You're just like, throw it out. But if even one of the brewers says, this is so bad I would dump it, then I tend to just go with what they think, because my palate is different than your palate or your palate. And what you want is a beer that's going to appeal to a fairly broad spectrum of people that like that kind of beer. And hopefully, you won't put into the blend something that's really unpleasant.
100%. And that's the thing as a brewer. It's always a tough decision when you sit around. It's like when you got a keg that's on the cusp of turning and things like that, and you say, well, guys, I don't think we should sell this. If it's one person out of 3 or 4 or 5, it's one person, and that makes your decision. You don't make your decision by yourself. You get to the point and say, listen, yeah, I think it's going. We're going to need to dump it, and dump it. Clean the lines, do a proper line clean, put a new keg back on and everything, and ensure that the quality is important, because that is what makes people come back, is the quality. They'll say, well, I had one yesterday and it was better than today. Taste it, test it, and obviously ensure that you're selling the best product that you can in the market. And speaking of which is your most popular sour beer that you guys brew at the moment?
Popular. Does that include Gozas or just the barrel aged?
You can break it up. I mean, you can say on the Goza side of things, and then you can have it on the barrel age side, and you can do it. I don't know, do a general maybe, like kind of, well, this is our go-to for your customers.
Well, certainly the Gozas are the most popular, no matter how you slice that up. Any single variation of our Goza, when we make 4 or 5, any one of those is more popular than all of our barrel-aged sour beers put together. The Gozas are very popular. All of them together constitute probably close to 50% of our total sales. So that's quite a bit of it. The barrel production is probably less than 10% of our total sales. And I think it's because, again, they're very different types of beers. The Gozas appeal to a broader spectrum of consumers, and the barrel-aged beer is just not for everybody. And the price is different. The barrel-aged beers, because they are aged in a barrel and for so long, we just have to charge a lot more for them. So they're really 2 different kinds of animals. I think the most popular of the Gozas is probably the blood orange that we make, but that's kind of neck and neck with the raspberry, which I really like, and the watermelon. But of the barrel-aged sour beers, this one, it really is. I think this is really one of the best beers we make, not just best sour beers, best beers we make. And I think it's our probably our most popular. But it takes a long time to make. It takes over a year to create.
Yes, no, obviously, and in that as well, inherently with the unpredictability of barrel-aged sour beers, how do you manage continuing brands, or do you change the brand, or do you just kind of stick to a strict um, brewing process using the same barrels and obviously following procedure to the temp? Also, when attempting a new sour beer with either fruiting or dry hopped, do you plan it out beforehand, or do you allow the beer to dictate the direction that you take it?
Um, so many questions. I'll answer the last one first. You know, to some degree, when we make a new beer, we kind of let the beer dictate where it's going. For example, we made a bunch of the horse tongue wheat, and we kind of overdid where, you know, we thought our sales level would be, and we had some extra barrels and we didn't know what to do with them. And our barrel guy at the time said, "Oh, prickly pear." So I thought, prickly pear. So we added prickly pear, and this was after the beer had been in there about a year. And so I wasn't sure if we really had enough bacteria and yeast still in there to get things going, but we did. And the beer was, I think it's fantastic beer. We also tried mango, and that was not as good. It was interesting, but not quite as good as the prickly pear. And then we've tried, you know, a lot of other fruits. So sometimes you make a beer and then think you need to add fruit, like this beer is not really quite there. And then you can think about the fruit additions. And sometimes you have a picture in your mind, like with the Thurible Current, when we did that, it was designed by our lab guy who now works down at Seismic Brewing, a guy named Andy Hooper. And he had a clear vision of what he wanted. He knew he wanted black currants in there, and he knew he wanted the triple wort. So we just kind of went with his idea, and I think it turned out to be a great beer.
Excellent. Do you do any dark sours?
Yes. We make a soured stout, which gets mixed reviews. Some people like it, some people don't. We make a kind of brownish, we call it our Grand Cru. It is a blend of our Belgian triple wort and our Belgian double wort together, and then sour that. And that's a fairly dark colored brown beer. The roasted malt is kind of more difficult to get that interplay with sour because it brings some acidity to the picture already. So dark beers are harder to sour than the light beers. Light beers, you know, are very kind of like fresh, and that acidity brings that, you know, builds that up, buoys that up some. But you can do dark beer.
And tell me, in terms of when you're doing a dark or a light, do you keep the cultures the same? Are you using different cultures? Where are you getting the cultures from, and all that kind of stuff, you know? So obviously for the sour side of the production.
So we are very fortunate in a lot of ways. We have several good yeast and bacteria labs near us on the West Coast. We have white labs, we have white yeast. They both have bacteria and yeast. And we often get our bacteria from them, one of those two. There are now apparently 5 or 6 other bacteria and yeast suppliers in the US. And you can mail order those internationally, certainly within the US. And then you need to grow them up once they come. They don't often come in pitchable quantities. But if you're already brewing, you should know how to grow up yeast or bacteria, same. And then the other thing that we're fortunate enough to have is a mixed culture that comes from our property. And we have done kind of a Solero method to keep that alive and keep that going. And it seems to be drifting some, and that's a concern for us. But we can always attempt to start over again. And so there are lots of different ways to do it. There is a brewery in Hawaii, Lanikai Brewing, and their brewer owner, Steve, he does wild captures from all over the place, including outer space. Um, he's quite an interesting character. His beers are fantastic. They're some of the best sour beers I've ever had. And they really run the gamut because he does these wild captures, and he's done them in different parts of different islands and on different islands. His brewery is on Oahu, but the Hawaiian Islands, there's many of them in the chain, and he'll fly to another island to do a capture there. So he's done a lot of them. And he even convinced an astronaut who is going to do some experiments in space to take up a petri dish. And while he had the screen pulled back at the very edge of our atmosphere, taking samples, to also open up and see if they could capture anything there. The guy brought it back. Steve looked at it under the microscope and looped out a couple things and brewed a beer with it.
So he brewed a space, well, end of the atmosphere. So there's still cultures that high up, which is amazing because obviously it kind of still needs a bit of oxygen, and the high up there's less oxygen and things like that. It's almost like finding the fish at the depths of the ocean, and how do they survive. So there's cultures really high up in the atmosphere. That is like super. And tell me, did he make it commercially, or did he do a couple of bottles and that was it, or did he keep the culture going?
I don't know if he's kept the culture going. I talk to him every couple of days. He's a fantastic guy, and great beers. But I'm not sure if that beer's ready for packaging yet. I tasted it about 6 months ago, when it was about 3 months old. And he uses those cultures, he keeps them going for as long as he can, and he uses them in beers that he does release commercially. Unfortunately, he's a very small brewery, so they're not widely available.
So yeah, do you want to get your hands on one of those and save it for a special occasion like lockdown? And speaking about lockdown, what are you guys busy doing at the moment? So we've always asked the guys at the moment, what are you able to do? So first of all, here in South Africa, we are in complete lockdown. We cannot brew, we cannot package, we cannot sell, we cannot distribute. It's a really sad state of affairs. I mean, what do your laws regulate you to do and not do at the moment?
Well, we brewing, they consider a food production, so we're an essential business. So we continue to operate. Some breweries have shut down, which is unfortunate. Brew pubs are not able to serve, so a lot of the brewers have shut down and just closed their doors and are just waiting. We shut our pub down because we're not allowed to open it. You can't have people coming in. Some breweries are doing to-go sales. Some people are actually delivering in the U.S., which is sort of legal, I think. But we've decided that we won't do any curbside sales. We'll close the pub. We'll just continue production. Package sales for a lot of breweries have gone up, which is interesting. People are, able to go to the grocery store, so they stock up on beer and wine while they're there. And so that's helped a lot of the breweries kind of get by. We initially didn't see that bump for the first 3 weeks. We are seeing it this week, last week a little bit, and this week some, and the orders for next week look good. So we're seeing a little bit of that now. We're working with a skeleton crew. Some of our folks have to take care of family, and so they are unable to come in. But everybody who wants to be here can. We, where'd they go? Oh, we just got masks for everybody. So
yes.
Mask up.
Very good. Very good.
Our state is talking about requiring masks for everyone. So we went out and we got those, and we're doing what we can. We've done a lot of deep cleaning. Certainly, we've reorganized a lot of stuff. The barrel room looks great. Our guys are out, scrubbing the fermenters, scrubbing the floor. We're still, brewing some, a lot less of actual brewing, but we're packaging a fair amount of the stuff we do have in process, and so we're getting that moved along. A lot of cleaning.
Yeah, cleaning, which is always important now more than ever before. Everything's got to be scrubbed, sanitized, and us as brewers, before the actual craziness of the world, we normally walk around with the bottle of your 70% ethanol in your hand, and you make sure everything's clean and sanitized. And now you just walk around with 2 bottles. There we go.
Never far.
So as you were saying, I'm at home, and there it is. You know, so now we're walking around with 2 pistols of sanitizer to keep everything clean. Oh, here we go. We got another one coming in. Where do you start planning a new beer? Where do you sit down? You sit down, guys. We're gonna brew a new beer.
We have 2 ways to kind of do it. Someone, often even not a brewer, comes and says, I want to make this kind of beer. In which case we have a homebrew system, large homebrew system, and we brew on that, and we see how it goes and go from there. The other way is that the owner says, the salespeople or I have noticed something out in the market that people are talking about or asking for, and we want to design one of those. And those are a little more difficult because you have you've got a goal to get to. But that's often a good way to make a beer too. So if you, for example, as a home brewer, you can say, today I want to make a Pilsner, and you make one. So you start there. And I think usually starting with the concept of what you want to drink, whatever kind of beer it is a great one. For example, I don't want to drink a black IPA. So unless we get a lot of requests out in the market for it, I'm just not going to make one. That's just me though.
Yes, yeah, it's not going to happen. Everything, yeah. So currently, obviously, you've packaged your beer, you've got it going. You're able still to do sales to liquor outlets. Have you considered maybe opening one of our other brewers has opened up a drive-through, for example? Is that something to look at?
We looked at that. If we were in a metropolis area, a larger population base, we might try that. We are out in the middle of nowhere in a very small valley. The town we're in has 500 people. A good percentage of them work at the brewery already. And I don't think that we're going to get a lot of local drive-through sales. We also wanted to support the grocery stores that are in town, the stores that do sell our beer in town. So we didn't want to take their sales away, so we continued to allow them to sell beer. Obviously, and if we did that, we'd compete with them. And I think if we had a lot more drive-through traffic, we might think about it. But people can always get our beer at the markets that are in town.
That's awesome. That is great that you supporting the local, and that's what we're trying to do here as well. Once we get out of the lockdown situation, get down, support local, support your local chain of brewers as well, instead of buying big commercial beers and everything, So we also have a big focus on supporting local. And the way that you say that, because it's such a small community, instead of doing direct sales, but moving it through your distribution channels, you obviously keep good faith with them. You make your money, they make their money, and everybody else is happy at the end of the day. Let's see what's happening on the thing here. We've got a couple things happening here. Do you bottle condition or force carb your sour beers, clean barrel or aged beers?
We force carbonate everything. We have toyed with doing bottle conditioning. It's a difficult process. Your upside is that your carbonation level is a little softer. And it sometimes, depending on the beer, can bring things to it. Certainly cask conditioned beers, English cask conditioned beers are a good example of that. But your downside is, particularly with bottling, if you, first of all, you got to bottle condition it, you got to, prime it all. Then you have to move it into an area that's going to be held at the correct temperature not too warm, not too cold, because it needs to be warm enough that that yeast ferments out all the sugar you put in. And then if the process isn't correct, you didn't get the right amount of yeast or the right amount of sugar or the right temperature to allow that to happen, you end up with bottles that are too sweet, and now you don't know what to do with them. So bottle conditioning at our scale is problematic at best, but we have tried it with varying degrees of success. I think Russian River does all of theirs bottle condition. I know it's really hard for them. I'm not sure what their losses are on bottles that are not carbonated, but it's like using natural cork in your wine. There are always going to be a few bottles out there that are corked and unsellable or undrinkable. So you don't want to send those out into the world and have people opening bottles that are undercarbonated and sweet. Just
like you want to make sure that you get consistency and yeah, bottle condition, unless you very particular, I'm sure you might get different results every single time. With forced carboning, you're going to get the same result every single time. So yeah.
And as you talked about earlier, quality, I don't want to sell bad beer ever, and not just because I don't want people to drink bad beer, which of course I don't, but everybody that has a mediocre or a bad beer, they're just not going to come back to your brand. So you're losing those customers, and the money you may make selling, an okay keg or an okay, lot of bottles that, you just want to get the, recoup your expenses. You're not really recouping your expenses. You're getting some immediate return, but in the long run, everybody that drinks a beer that they're like, meh, they're not going to drink your beer again. I mean, I'm a beer drinker, and I know all you guys are beer drinkers. And when you buy a bottle and it's fantastic, you remember that and you go back to it. And you buy a bottle that's like, meh, even one that's not bad, it's just not great. I'm not going to spend money on that beer again. I'm just not going to. So quality is everything. It's everything.
100%. And like you said, we spend most of our time cleaning and sanitizing. Now, the final question for the evening. When you finished with the barrel and you've blended your beers and everything, do you steam the barrel? Do you just give it a hot water rinse? Or do you go meticulously and leave water in it, and then you clean it out and then ready for the next brew?
You can do any of those things, and we have tried them all. Usually what we do is we kind of package to order as much as we can. So for example, if we have a lot of beer that a lot, L-O-T, not a whole bunch, but a group of beer that we need to get out of the barrel, it's been in there long enough, the beer is ready, and we're ready to package. If we think we're going to move through that beer, what we like to do is brew the same beer and run it into the same barrels. So if we have, the horse tongue wheat, and we're going to package 30 barrels worth, we want to brew and then reuse those barrels as quickly as possible. And for sour beers, that's an excellent way to do it, because you don't have to steam the barrels. They still have bacteria and everything that you want in there. There's nothing bad in there, otherwise you would have tossed that barrel and not used it. And if you can empty the barrel and get beer back in there the same day, that's your best case scenario. Now, that's not always possible. For those times that that's not possible, we do have a barrel steamer. We have steamed them and then filled them with a type of sanitizer to hold them. But no sanitizer is very good. They all break down over time. They're not good for the wood. And so what you end up with, if you leave them long enough, is that you just got water in them, and then stuff starts to grow in the water, and you're gonna have to throw them away anyway. If you store them dry, which will keep bacteria and things from growing in there, then you end up with a dry barrel. The staves shrink, and when you fill it back up, it just leaks everywhere. So you can put water in there to like pre-hydrate it, but then that's a big hassle of a process. And whatever flavor was in there, you've now diluted and you're losing. For non-sour beers, we just use the barrel. It depends on the beer. Excuse me. It depends on the beer, but we never use them more than twice. Sometimes single use only, depending on the beer. And then sometimes we use them twice. But then for those, we immediately evacuate them and fill them up the same day. We never let them go even overnight because we just don't want stuff to start growing in there. And after 2 times, if you're going with a bourbon barrel and you want bourbon flavor, after 2 times, you've pulled out most of the bourbon flavor. And that 3rd time, because there's no acidity to protect that beer, and usually these beers aren't, more than about 8% alcohol, there's not a lot of alcohol to protect them. And after that 3rd time, you're getting bacteria start to grow in those barrels. And you're just running the risk. And we've done that. And we've dumped a lot of that 3rd use barrel beer. I have like 20 cases of a beer that's about 4 years old now, sitting at home that was all infected. And I keep thinking, it's going to get better. And I open a bottle about every 6 months and it's horrible. And I should have just thrown it out to begin with.
That's brilliant. So in other words, basically planning, once again, packaging, brewing, refilling as soon as possible. Don't let them stand around. Bourbon barrels you want to use once, twice, never a 3rd time, because as you said, you think to yourself it's going to get better, but it's not. So yeah, that's a great thing to do. Fel, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. I wish you and your team at Anderson Valley a good summer. Let's hope everything kind of sorts itself out over the next couple of months. Yeah, that's it. And at least you guys can keep going and keep brewing. We are going to have a tough time here. We're going into winter now, so winter months are tough for a number of brewers just because it's winter. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us on Beer Bootcamp sessions, and we look forward to chatting to you soon. Tomorrow night we actually have got we've got Neva from White Labs Yeasts talking around the same time. Yeah.
Nice. Well,
I will.
having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. What I'll do is I'll pop you, if you have got some spare time. I know you guys are busy cleaning and everything, but we'll pop you the link as well, and you're welcome to pop in and come and catch up on on Beer Bootcamp sessions.
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Honor.
Brilliant. Look forward to the next one. Val, to you and your family, take care. All the best. And to everybody out there, stay safe. And we look forward to the next Beer Bootcamp session. See you tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.